Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Bioinformatics CRO Podcast. I'm your host, Grant Belgard, and joining me today is Razib Khan. Razib, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, Grant. I am the Director of Science at the Insitome Institute. I run a few blogs. I do a lot of random things. So I run a blog called Gene Expression, genexp.com. I run a blog called Brown Pundits, brownpundits.com. I run a podcast for the Insitome Institute, The Insight. So just check on Stitcher, iTunes, whatever. And I also run a podcast called Brown Pundits. That's just like a fun podcast on the side. I have a Twitter, Razib Khan. That's basically it. I do some other things. I do some consulting, Grant and I have like a conflict of interest. Maybe we should just disclose. I have worked for Grant in the past. Yeah, so I have my fingers in a lot of different things.
Yeah, I love your blogs. Highly recommend your blogs. I know I've kept up with them for a long time, and a lot of other people have as well. So what made Razib Razib?
Yeah, so what? Combination of genes and environment. If I want to think like a behavior geneticist. So I do have a pedigree of I have three siblings, and I can tell you that there's much more concordance between my youngest brother and myself, though we didn't really grow up together because I'm way older than him. So that does suggest that there's a strong heritable component of some of my tendencies. But in terms of like growing up, where I grew up in Eastern Oregon. So I think that gives me a very different perspective than a lot of people I've met in academia who grew up, say, in like upper middle class suburbs. I grew up in quote unquote cowboy country. There were literal cowboys at my high school in terms of that's what they did after school as their job. So, I have like a different cultural perspective. I consider myself a Northwesterner, but I've lived in urban areas my adult life. So, I've seen the startup scene. I've lived in the Bay Area. I've lived in Austin. And so what made me me is kind of like having this peripatetic life background, I think, where I lived in rural areas. My dad was a college professor, and then lived in urban areas, and I saw like the global economy. I see the global economy. My family's from Bangladesh, but I'm obviously an American. And in terms of my intellectual interests, I started in biochemistry as an undergraduate because my family is Asian American, and if you're going to do biology, it has to be biochemistry or biomed, but they don't really understand it. But I was always attracted to genetics, so I actually did a fair amount of molecular genetics as electives for the biochemistry, which biochemistry was in the chemistry department. It wasn't in the biology department.
A respectable degree.
Basically, what we always say is we had to take physical chemistry. Okay, which that it wasn't an physical at my university. Physical chemistry was a very difficult course, and so that was like we took physical chemistry. We're legit chemists. Okay. So that's where I started, but eventually like I faded back towards genetics, genomics. I'm not really good with my hands in terms of like doing the pipetting and stuff like that. So bench work was never my thing. I worked in IT for a while, and then eventually I went to grad school at UC Davis. I did not finish, so I'm still everything but dissertation. And I worked in evolutionary genomics, mostly with mammals, and I do a lot of work with humans. I've worked with personal genomics companies. I have a lot of interest in history. And so that gives me a unique skill set in being able to do the data science, doing some algorithm writing, as well as knowing basically what outputs are intelligible to the end user, which can be kind of difficult if you're a technical science person. Anyone who has ever seen an error output on a computer understands that that can be a problem with the technical person because the error output does not tell a normal person anything except scares them, you know? And so that is a skill, being able to think about what the consumer needs, definitely, that I bring, I think, to the table.
And where do you think you're heading in the future? I mean, obviously you have very broad-based interests, and you found your way to science communication platforms. And is that something you're planning on doubling down on? Or?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what, like I'm using a startup term, using what your bandwidth is, right? I still do write for various publications when I get the chance. I don't do it really for the money. There's not that much money in it, but who else is going to, speak about what I speak about? If there's another Razib Khan that's out there, just tell me, and I'll give him my notes, and I'll just move on because I got 3 kids. I'm a busy guy. You know what I'm saying? So I do it partly because who else is going to do that? But the Insitome Institute, like part of its purview is to do the science communication, and that's what Spencer Wells and I, my boss, who's the director, we do the Insight podcast. And so yeah, there's still a lot of science communication that is to be done and that I do expect to be doing. But I also do work in consumer genomics, as you know. I do a fair amount of contracting and consulting with people, and I do have some experience in that space that I like to provide. I am trying to actually finish some papers, which I don't know if I should talk about, but I'll just put it out there. I am trying to finish some papers on some topics that nobody else seems to be really interested in, and get that out there. So I'm trying to do like a bunch of different things. So I'm not like in a situation where I have like a straightforward, what am I going to do with my next 20 years? The past 20 years have been pretty surprising to me. I mean, who knew what genomics based data science was 20 years ago? It wasn't a thing. So what's going to be a thing 20 years from now? And I think a lot of people feel this way. So my goal is to be nimble and just go with the punches and just try to survive in this world, because it's pretty tough right now.
You'll find your way. So speaking of consumer genomics companies, what's your take on what's been happening in that space in recent years, and where do you think things are heading?
Well, so I did a podcast with Libby Copeland, Lost Families, and we talked a little bit about that on the Insight in April. If listeners want to look that up, just do type Libby Copeland. She has a book out, Lost Families, and so she asked me that, and we had a discussion a little back and forth because she's done all this research in consumer genomics. And I know the people consume. I have friends who work at 23andMe, friends who work in Ancestry. My boss founded the Genographic Project. I actually have consulted for Linda Avey, the co-founder of 23andMe. I consider her a friend. She's a really good person, by the way. I'm just gonna put that out there. I can say anything bad about her. But so I've had a lot of discussions. So it seems like there's a leveling off of growth in that field. So why is that? Some people say, oh, it's because of privacy concerns. Other people say, well, I mean, it's kind of market saturated for the initial wave of consumers. I suspect it's both. I do think the privacy concerns are starting to spook a lot of people, and who they're spooking is the next marginal consumer, right? So the initial consumers that were going to get it, they were going to get it no matter what. You could like say, oh, we're going to use your DNA and we're actually going to release it out into the cloud in a tarball and everyone can access it. And there's like a core group of people that just don't care. They're still going to do it. Okay. So those people are insensitive to that. As you get further and further out through word of mouth, because these are Christmas gifts, these are, things people talk about over Thanksgiving in terms of their results, a lot of awkward results sometimes, sometimes
And
not
just to
awkward.
interject here, Grace, who's helping us out with this podcast right now, got as a Christmas gift from me an Insitome
Oh, okay.
ancestry kit.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Yeah. So, eat your own dog food, right? And I've been on all the
oh,
platforms. I've been on all the platforms. So, there's ups and downs to all of them. And, it's an interpretation service. They're all interpretation service. So, the killer app of the past decade that's just gone by was genealogy and ancestry to a great extent. The medical aspect hasn't really been unlocked yet. Uh, I do think it will be. So right now we have about 10% of Americans on these platforms. Okay, 30 million people. Probably a little bit more than 30 now, but it's really leveled off. But that's about 10% of Americans. I don't believe by 2030 we're going to be any lower than say 75%. Okay? I think a lot of young kids will be genotyped, sequenced, low coverage, various coverage sequencing. Grant, you work in the medical genetics space, medical genomics, the gains that can be had by detecting, novel variants of unknown significance in very young children, if they have some idiopathic condition. And these are not most children, but there's enough of them that a lot of hospitals are already doing this with, quote, mystery conditions for newborns, because newborns cannot give you any feedback really of what's going on with them, right? So these are niche cases. They're little segments, but the segments keep on expanding. So, those of us that remember the internet in the 1990s, which Grace probably does not remember, but it was like super exciting for a lot of us. And we had no idea what people were going to do. We had like fantasies. Like I will tell you, Grant, like I think I'm a little older than you. I remember getting on Gopher, which is kind of a pre-web thing. It was like a text interface. And I remember reading about Ethiopia on the CIA Gopher page for Ethiopia. And I was super excited because I could read about Ethiopia without opening an encyclopedia or going to the library. That's what I thought the internet was. I mean, that's what the internet was in 1993. And now the internet's a lot different. I mean, now the internet's podcast, Twitter, a lot of stuff that is good and also considerably bad stuff. But different than what I was expecting. And so this is, 25 years since I got on the internet, and I couldn't have guessed what we see around. I mean, like some things I could have guessed, but a lot of it is like super surprising to me. And so I think with genomics, let's say 2010 is the same as 1995. Like that's when 23andMe really came out with a big marketing push, and people started talking about personal genomics, and it was pretty low boil, I think, for the first 5 years, and then it really like jumped up right before 2019. A lot of this is marketing spend. If you look at Ancestry's marketing spend, as their marketing spend increased, there was like a linear response with purchases. I know through the grapevine, the former CEO of Ancestry, he kind of admitted this. Basically, they did not expect that there was going to be a linear response to their marketing spend. I think it was a little bit more than linear because word of mouth triggered and kicked in at some point. And so it just became one of those gifts, like $100 price point, like $99, $79, perfect price point. And
Black
so
Friday sales,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And so it just became a thing. And like YouTube unboxings of Ancestry kits became a thing. So it's become part of our culture, but it hasn't become ubiquitous. And so I think that's the next step, becoming ubiquitous. I think medical is going to help make it ubiquitous. But the problem with medical and consumer is you don't want to buy a kit that tells your mom that she's going to develop breast cancer by the time she's 60. Okay. Like, I mean, telling people that they have health risks is not a feel good gift. Um, so they need to figure that out. I'm not a marketing person. It's not my job, but I think probably some sorts of distribution deals with hospitals is really the way to go. But I think that's the future. And also, I wouldn't be surprised if some European country with socialist or semi-socialist medicines just like instead of building out our own genomic service for our citizens, let's just contract to Ancestry or 23andMe, and have them build something for us, turnkey, and then maybe the data is stored in those countries with like some bureaucrat somewhere. I know, for example, Estonia is trying to do things to provide genetic kits and services to its people just as part of their national health, because I know a scientist who is like on the government board, and at a conference he came up to me and started asking me questions about it because they're like, we're serious, we're a small country, we can scale it, and they have really, really good distribution and fluency with information technology. Because this is what it is. Genomics is information technology.
So speaking of data protection and distribution, where do you think those genomes will be housed, right? There have been a
Yeah,
lot of ideas about this, and many of them are in conflict with one another.
yeah. Well, so I think it depends on the country. In China, they're going to be housed where the government wants them to be housed, and the government's going to know everything about your genome. That's they're already sampling males because they want to get genealogy, like genetic profiles of potential criminals, because 20% of or 90% of violent crimes are committed by men. Okay, so that's why they're targeting males. And so in China, that's going to be like that. In Europe, they have the GDPR, like it's like the data protection law, GDPR. That's what genetic data is under, and different countries have like different ways they enforce it. So in France, genetic testing of the sort that we do in the United States for consumers is banned. Like they have to ship it to Belgium, drive to Belgium, and pick it up if you're like a French genetic genealogy fanatic. Okay, there are some. I think in Germany they've loosened it recently, but Germans have a fraught relationship with genetic science. So if it's anything related to human genetics, they are really terrified of it, and so that's kind of not a good market. But other European countries like Scandinavia are much more open and much more enthusiastic. So how do they deal with the privacy? One idea that Spencer and I have been kicking around is some sort of encryption key where you're the only one that can unlock it, which is, kind of thing that is relatively common. And now with the blockchain and all these crypto, companies. And so just cryptify, your genome. So your genome never changes. So, okay, you're the only one who is able to unlock it that way. Of course, the problem is if you lose the key, it's gone. But then sequencing is pretty cheap too. So you could just redo it again. So I mean, that's one solution. The issue with genomics that I would say is, people, I mean, aside from somatic mutations, your sequence does not change, right? Your germline mostly doesn't change. There's a few mutations over time if you're male, whatever. Anyway, mostly it's there. So if someone has it, they have it forever. So my genotype and a VCF of my whole genome sequence is actually publicly searchable. If anyone wants to search Razib Khan genotype, you can find them. I'm not like scared personally because I'm not an important enough person where someone would design a bioweapon to to come after me. I mean, it's going to be way cheaper to hire a hitman. Okay. If I was the head of
Do
state,
you already have life insurance?
I do have life insurance. So,
Excellent. All
you
right.
know,
So you're set.
but if I was the head of state somewhere, there would be a concern, right? Maybe. But bioweapons are expensive, kludgy, and not very effective. I'm not super worried about that. There will be a point where sequencing will be so cheap and so many people have done it in so many different places that I do wonder if privacy concerns will just disappear. We share a lot on social media about ourselves. Nobody seems super stressed about it, even though if you had talked to people like a couple of decades ago, they'd be like, that's creepy. So, I mean, I wonder if people will be more chill about it in the future. One of the weak points is hospitals. They're not very good about database data protection. Like there have been traditionally problems with a lot of hospitals, and they usually just pay a fine and then they're like, whatever. The issue is like, if you do your genome and they release it by mistake,
Once and
I
done.
mean, it's just, yeah, it's out there, it's out in the wild, and so I don't really know the long term prospects for privacy. I think in the short term, I think the privacy, yeah, it's feasible if you care. Like I don't care, but if you care, there are services you can go to that are very bespoke, where I think like you can pretty sure trust they're deleting your data and stuff like that. But that's not going to be the $1,000 genome or the $300 genome. That's going to be people that will charge you a premium, because they're going to validate everything in a way where it's like, that, I mean, they're deleting everything. They're sending you a physical copy. There are things you can do like that, right? I think in the short term, we don't know for sure, but I strongly suspect that a lot of consumers are going to be okay with a lot less privacy than you would think.
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, so I'm on 23andMe, I guess, under really a pseudonym.
Yeah.
I'd paid cash for a prepaid card, had the kit shipped to another state, an address that was completely unconnected to me.
Yeah.
And through a series of coordinated happenings, I got the kit in my own hands.
Nice.
But of course, these things can be triangulated through family members and whatnot. So it's not foolproof.
Yeah,
Right.
if you're a white American, it's highly likely that you are easy to identify. Like it's like 95% likely now, just because there's enough people in there. Like if you're adopted and you don't want to know who your relatives are, do not do this.
Right.
Because you'll automatically get a match, and maybe you can like delete it from your mind who you matched with, but that's going to give you information automatically. So when you have 10% penetration, that's penetration of almost all the pedigrees for white Americans. There's still some gaps for Black Americans, although that's closing, and other groups. But really, the way the statistics of this work is you don't need to sample that much to get all the pedigrees.
Right. Interesting. So, based on the mumblings you hear, what things do you expect to transpire in the coming years that you think relatively few other people are expecting?
Well, I don't know because it's difficult because like I don't talk to normal people about genetics. Because anyone who I know, they know, you know what I'm saying? They know everything because I just talk to them about it. I'm just like, oh yeah, this is gonna happen. So for example, I talked to my friend Rob Henderson, and he's a prominent person. He's a writer. He happens to be from kind of a lower class background, and he went to Yale. He doesn't know who his biological father was. So he's getting his PhD in social psychology, I think, at Oxford. He's a smart guy. And he was shocked when I told him, don't do a DNA test if you don't want to know who your dad's family is, because you'll automatically know. And he was like, really? And I was like, yeah. I mean, your dad's a generic white American. It's in there. You'll automatically know if you're like ambivalent, which he was. Um, he shouldn't do that. So he didn't know, right? So for example, I think I told Grant this story. I don't remember if I did because it's a really weird story. One of my friends was asking about, well, he heard his dad, he's from a small town in the Midwest, okay? He heard his dad had an affair and he had a half sibling. And he's like, should I use one of these tests to find this half sibling. Do you think what are the chances? I'm like, oh, you're gonna find something, like not necessarily the half sibling, but you could like figure things out of who's related to who and all this stuff. And he did get a match of someone who looked like a half sibling, but it turned out it wasn't a half sibling. It was his stepdad's sister. So he found out that his stepdad was his biological dad. He didn't end up finding out his biological dad. And so he told me this on Thanksgiving, and he said he's not going to tell his mom and he's not going to tell his stepdad, who he hates. And so these are the things that are going to come out. And obviously I don't even know if his stepdad knows, because I think his mom was probably, his mom might not know about his parentage, okay? But my friend's problem is he saw the match with his step aunt, so she probably saw the match with him. So don't open something that you don't know how to, like, it's like a Jack in the Box is coming at you. Don't be surprised. Don't be surprised, because the result, and like sometimes it's funny and silly, where it's like, I had a friend and she's like, classic Southern California blonde, and her husband, who's 100% Irish American, but she's like, I think he's part black because his features. Okay. I was like, well, you guys should just do the test together. So if because they want to have kids. It turns out they both had like a hemochromatosis. They're carriers for something. So it's not a big deal, but whatever. But here's the funny thing. He turned out to be 100% Irish. She was 2% African American. She was 2% African. And so we figured out that there's a blank spot in her mom's genealogy in the early 19th century, And so this is not like a shocking thing. It was just a big laugh that she was looking for black ancestry in her husband. And it turned out that she herself had an ancestor who'd passed from black to white in the early 19th century, which is not like super uncommon, And so and that's silly. That doesn't affect a lot of people. But I've been, with the genealogy thing, you might think it's silly, but a lot of people, it shakes them in weird ways, which, I didn't find anything super shocking. I found some surprising things, but I didn't find anything super shocking. So I can't relate to that personally. And honestly, who really cares who your ancestors were? That's just my personal opinion about me. But a lot of people, it's a much deeper thing. And, there's all these stories that go along with it. So I consult on Skip Gates' show. I didn't mention that. I consult on his DNA show on PBS. And so George R.R. Martin, he has the thing where his paternal grandfather's Italian and he's from Jersey and he's got this Italian background. But actually, it turns out that his paternal grandfather was not his biological paternal grandfather. His paternal grandmother was a secretary for a Jewish guy, and that's his biological grandfather. So we found that out through the genetic testing, because he was 25% Jewish, not 25% Italian. Now, I'm only bringing this up because I don't know if Martin, I didn't watch the episode, I don't know how he reacted, but he always had this shtick he was talk about, like, well, he was like Martino or something, and he's Italian and he's from Jersey. Well, he can kind of keep the story because the way you're raised is the way you're raised, but his understanding of like being Italian, it's gonna be, I don't know if he wants to bring up the fact, well, I'm also part Jewish, and there's a lot of things like that change family stories, and that's not super significant. The disease stuff can be super significant, and I've had to talk to friends about stuff they found out, which was surprising, which was sobering, because the disease stuff is never, oh, it turns out I'm Superman and I have superpowers. There's no gain of function mutation that makes you have a secret invisibility power that you didn't know about. So it's never like positive, really. I mean, for some people it's positive where they didn't have the risk for an autosomal dominant, but really mostly it's just like
but of course,
thing.
Something like that wouldn't be shocking, right? It's
yeah.
you kind of do your little Punnett squares or whatever. So
yeah. So for other people, I have found out things, and a lot of people, they don't connect two and two. So I'm not always aware of what diseases are and aren't genetic. So I found out, like, I'll give you your listeners a concrete example. A friend of mine is at high risk for cataracts, very high risk, like for early, basically, like, he's gonna go blind early. Probably they're gonna have to do surgery. Hopefully they have a correction. But anyway, his family's from India, and one of his parents went blind, but that's just really common in India due to the very eye infections and stuff. And so that's what he assumed it was. Because he had, that parent had an eye infection of some sort. And so the doctor actually said, like, oh, it's probably because you had the eye infection and that's causing the blindness and all this stuff. And so that was what my friend knew. And, he's a college educated person, he has a science degree, and he had just assumed that was what it was. But he got his parent tested, he got him tested, and they both have some sort of autosomal dominant, where it's like you have like a 50% chance of getting cataracts by the time you're 50. He's 37 now. So anyway, it's just something that's on his mind. He has a 50% chance. He has like a 90% chance by the time he's like 65, whatever. And I haven't kept up with like, the surgeries and other things he might have to do to not go totally blind. But that was an awkward conversation because when he got the testing, I was like, oh, there's like an only small probability that there's going to be anything that's going to be a problem, which is true. Your prior is you're not going to discover anything new. But there's going to be a minority of people that are going to discover the new thing, and it's not going to be a little new thing. If it's a disease thing, it's going to be a big thing. If it's going to add value, because knowing that you have a 1.5 greater odds of type 2 diabetes is not that big of a deal. That's not really actionable. It's not going to change you very much. But knowing that you have 25 times odds of getting cataracts by the time you're 20 or by the time you're 50 is a big deal. And I kind of felt kind of crappy because I told him honestly that don't worry, bro. Like you're not gonna find anything. If you don't know, you're not gonna you don't know anything in your family. You know it from your family background. That's literally what I said. But there are things like this that happen. So I think this sort of stuff is going to affect our lives in the next decade. Now, how that's going to affect consumer purchasing decisions, I don't know, because that's just an awkward sell. But the kits and the tests are going to get from the people that are deploying them to the people that have to use them, and that's going to go back to the doctors. It's going to go back to like the healthcare system. That has to happen so that people can make better decisions with their lives. I kind of sound like an infomercial here, but that's basically what it is, right? Like it's informational to people why you would want to do this. Now, some people, they want to put it off as long as possible. That's a choice. In some countries, they're not going to give you the choice. I'm 90% sure in Britain, they're not going to give you the choice, because the national healthcare system is soup to nuts. They take care of you top to bottom. And so they're invested in you knowing as early as possible so they can make the decision for you. They can kind of nudge you, because they're already nudging people. And so they really want to nudge you hard, I think, if they find out that you have certain risks, certain dispositions, and they don't want you to make life decisions that will get you really ill, because then they're on the hook for it.
Well, certain HMOs might be the same way. Kaiser.
Yeah. The issue with HMOs in the United States is they're very, very sensitive and vulnerable to bad public relations. Okay. When you have a government monopoly, they're far less sensitive to bad public relations. As long as the government doesn't cut their funding, they're fine. That's the downside of a monopoly. That's the downside of socialized medicine, run by the government. There's no way you have leverage against it aside from through the government itself. The upside is they can make some unilateral decisions. I do think a lot of innovation might actually happen in Europe because it's a monopoly and people are scared in the United States. People are scared across the whole world of genetic science, partly because of Gattaca and the Nazis and all this stuff. But, used correctly, it can make your life better. And so how do you get people over the hump? Well, in a system where the government has socialized the cost, you as an individual don't have the final choice on everything, And I think that might allow certain innovation to happen, and then eventually comes back to the United States as people see, oh, they're not using it to round up the genetically unfit. And if they are using it to round up the genetically unfit, then we're not gonna do that, right? So I'm just saying that, we're gonna see experimentation across the whole world with this sort of science and with this sort of technology, and we're gonna see what works and what doesn't work and how things work differently,
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens in China in this space.
That's a word for it. Interesting, yeah.
So where do you think science is is heading, and the ways that we do science over the next 1 to 2 decades, right? Tech
Mm-hmm.
and all the knock-on social
Mm-hmm.
effects of tech is kind of revolutionizing everything.
Yeah.
What do you think
Yeah.
this impact and the broader political impact will be
Yeah.
on science and the conduct of science?
I mean, it's weird. Like science has had like multiple phases. Science and technology has had multiple phases of enthusiasm and doom and fear. So Sputnik era, enthusiasm. 1970s, the environmentalist movement, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think like in the 80s, and then into the early internet era. I mean, not to be the old guy, but I remember like 1995 to 2000, and oh my god, like we were so optimistic about the internet. Um, you know, we didn't realize at the time.
Democratize the world, right?
Yeah, like it's like, oh, I can talk to somebody in Ecuador. I specifically remember having a chat to somebody in Ecuador, and I'm told my friends the next day, I talked to somebody in Ecuador. It was like so amazing. And now in 2020, it turns out I didn't anticipate like how toxic Twitter would be, how social media is used to destroy people. All of these things, like you can go back and read about it. Like people did not anticipate that. Like we didn't understand the human capacity for depravity. And I'm using that in a very broad sense. Like Facebook has been used to coordinate ethnic cleansing in some countries. Like we didn't anticipate that. We thought it would bring people together. And now today, I think a lot of people, when they're not on the web, when they're not on the internet, they're happier. Like being disconnected is a thing. I mean, when I get an email, it's a now what sort of situation. Whereas like 25 years ago or even 20 years ago, I was like, who emailed me?
You've
But
got mail.
yeah, it was like exciting. It was exciting. Like, oh, my girlfriend's emailing me. Like I remember like that was a big thing. It's like, oh, will she email me today? Even though we saw each other every day. So I mean that was like an exciting thing. And now today it's just like I just don't want to be bothered. They're just like I get a lot of requests because I'm like quote public. I'm a public person, and so I get a lot of direct messages. And sometimes I try to respond, but sometimes it's just like I just can't respond. People have all these questions and all these requests, and I just can't deal with it. So it's made the whole world accessible to me, but now I'm accessible to the whole world. And so that's a downside of information technology that we didn't anticipate. So what about genetics? I don't think that we know all of the consequences of knowing all of your relatives. We've talked for decades, I think, in genetic science of like, okay, like how is this going to affect dating? So I've never done internet dating or anything like that. I've been non-single since the year 2003, right? So it's like this is all like abstract for me. But I can see a situation where, like in the Jewish community, everyone knows it's a Tay-Sachs carrier. You don't want to marry somebody with that. Well, just like automatically with your dating profiles, do an intersection with carriers so that you know. I mean, a lot of people are just on, if you're on Tinder, you're probably not thinking that far into the future. But if you're on Match.com, you might be, you know? And so, depending on your level of seriousness, you might want to exchange that information ahead of time.
It's more efficient. I mean, unless you want to go through IVF.
Yeah, just get it. Yeah, just get it out of the way. Some people don't care, but I mean, if you want to anticipate having to do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which some people might have to do, maybe just get that out of the way and don't have it be a surprise. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of weird things. Like some people have bad credit. Like, I mean, I don't. Do you ask people immediately? Probably not. I mean, there's things about people you don't ask immediately, and there's other things you do. I don't know if the genetic thing is going to be one you ask immediately. The issue with genetics that I always tell people though is genetics is also something you see on someone's face. So you see me, you automatically kind of know where my ancestors are from. My risk of being a cystic fibrosis carrier is quite low. Like you just know that as a prior, right? So it's not like genetics is a total mystery. Just like you kind of know how much money someone makes by the car they drive and the way they're dressed. There's always information that you get from people, and it's how much you want to put out there. The thing with genetics, though, is I mean, you could fake a sequence, but really, I mean, I'm just saying, like, your genes are your genes. Like, if you're being honest about it, and at some point, we're probably gonna have to do some validation services where, like, this is like, it's like the SSL of the sequence. Because what if someone sends you a fake sequence? Because they don't want to tell you that they have some autosomal dominant. Okay, like what if it's common in dating services and you carry the autosomal dominant for Huntington's? And like even if people aren't in it for a serious relationship, they just don't want to deal with it. Because that's kind of heavy, you know? I know people who I don't know them personally, but I know a woman whose sister has Huntington's and her nephew will not get tested because he has a 50% chance of being a carrier. You know, she tells him that he should be like super serious about protection then because he's not, she basically said he's not the most irresponsible kid. And so, well, what if that's on dating profiles? What if you can check it? I think a lot of people, it's just like when you blackball people for like employment because their credit rating is bad. That's kind of unfair in a way. So is it unfair to not want to date somebody seriously that has Huntington's? Or is gonna because they're gonna develop Huntington's if they carry the autosomal dominant, right? So I mean, these are like social questions that we don't have to confront today because most people haven't gotten sequenced. And Huntington's, as you guys know, it's a repeat, and so I'm not sure if it's gonna be on a genotype array. Like you'd have to do some sort of tagging. So it's not even trivial to just have it with your 23andMe, you know, even if they could provide it. Like it has to be like whole genome sequencing. So the technology is a little bit in the future, but it's gonna be something we confront. Like if you are a person that has an autosomal dominant disease that's going to present later in life, that's pretty that's pretty heavy. That's pretty heavy. And this is why a DNA test for Huntington's disease is not a feel good consumer product. Like this is the problem.
Yeah. So where do you think academic science is heading?
So basically COVID-19 has accelerated certain things, and the financial crisis in academia, that was going to happen because of demographics, because Zoomers are a much smaller generation than millennials, was going to happen, is happening now. There are some departments that are laying off, mostly not in science. STEM is not predominantly dependent on tuition money or liberal arts colleges, or when universities get NIH and NSF. So academic science is special in certain ways where there's certain types of innovation, certain creativity that occurs there that is really difficult to happen or really does not happen in industry because industry is more siloed, just the way the sociology works, right? You don't get the cross fertilization in the seminars, just doesn't happen. So there's a reason academic science is there. I do think academic science is getting too politicized. Um, well, what's the next consequence? One consequence is when people are looking to what to allocate resources to, the National Science Foundation, NSF, funds non-practical things. That's its goal. It will have practical implications a lot of the times way down the line, but NSF is where you go if you're an ecology lab and you're not going to get funded by NIH, which you're not, and you can't get funding. I mean, there's different ways, you know. So I think that will be cut. I think trust in academia and faith in academia is declining. That means public academia, public academics will have problems because if you're in a red state, when they go to allocate budgets, they're going to cut. Now, I know universities get a lot of funding from various sources. I don't really know how comfortable a lot of academic scientists are going to be with public-private partnerships, but that's probably going to be a thing just to survive. There are some universities, agricultural universities, where I went to UC Davis. They were actually very happy with that, and that's part of the tradition. Monsanto, or whatever the company's called now, has a lot of projects there. But a lot of scientists and universities are not happy with that.
Hopefully, Nassim Taleb is not listening to this podcast.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if he is, he'll say we're morons and idiots. But Berkeley, for example, is very, very anti-Monsanto, anti-public-private. I've heard friends where it's like they were discouraged from ever looking into that because it would be seen badly, kind of, by their department. So, but I think they need to look at that because the funding is going to be an issue. There's also overproduction of scientists. They're not all going to like land in academic spots. There's going to be a reduction in R2 universities, Research 2 universities, liberal arts colleges that absorb some people. That means everyone's going to be competing for the same few spots. They're already having, 1,000 applicants for one job. So it's kind of seems a bit like a hellscape. A lot of people are going to be really stressed and anxious. In a way, academics are actually quite privileged. When I was a grad student at UC Davis, I got the best health insurance I ever had, by the way, because the UC system is part of the California buying system. And so they buy gold-plated insurance for everybody, at least for graduate students and above. And so there's a lot of good perks that come with it, even though people complain. And that's not a law of the universe. It's the way our American society works today to give people the leisure to study things that they love and that they're passionate about. Like I talked to some people on the Senate staff of a prominent Republican. I'm not gonna name who, but you'd recognize the name. And they were like, yeah, we can't defund the universities because they would say that we were like primitive barbarians. But the first chance we really get without the media saying that, we'll do it. Yes.
Well, it's been quite interesting. As you mentioned, that broad-based support has fallen apart in relatively recent times.
Yeah.
Just recent years. And this politicization is nothing new in the humanities and so on. It is newer in terms of the kind of openness of the content and things like this in the sciences.
The whole atmosphere is very, very hothouse, and hothouses, they eventually burn out, and so it will. What cannot be sustained won't be, and I feel like that's going to be the issue in academia, which might be good for industry. More people with abilities and skills and talent will go into the private sector, but we're going to be losing something. We're going to be losing some really curious, creative people who might have gone in some impractical directions that would give us some real innovation.
Do you think there will be a decoupling uh, uh, between traditional universities and funded research?
I think there will be more diversity of think tank research institutes, and also I think we seriously need to consider the European Technical University. Technical universities exist to further technical knowledge, period, right? And that's fine. People would fund that. I mean, you can be a communist. Who cares? If you're working in solid state physics and you're building a better microchip, nobody cares. Okay, that's your business. What your politics are.
So I want to make sure we have some time to talk about the elephant in the room before we wrap up. COVID. So what the hell happened? How did we end up here? Where do you think things are going?
Yeah, I wrote an article in City Journal in April where I basically said it was elite. So people can Google Razib Khan City Journal, but basically I said the elite systematic failure. And I mean, I should have probably like emphasized Trump more if I was going to be totally honest, but I didn't, probably because everything when it becomes about Trump, it goes crazy. So I didn't say much about Trump in the piece. So my thesis is the American society as a whole is obsessed with symbolic, just kind of like like the postmodernist stuff where it's like all about like, oh, the word you use and the representation and the symbol. And that is actually what Trump is good at. He's good at these nicknames. But what we really need to lead us right now is an engineer, like someone that can do the cost versus benefit, that can do the math. That's not our political elite right now. In fact, our political elite is mostly lawyers. They're mostly talkers. So as listeners know, you can't debate COVID away. Like you can't beat them by out arguing them, by redefining them. Trump has kind of tried to do that a couple of times. Even into the middle of February, you were crazy. You were like all the cool kids, all the blue checks on Twitter said you were crazy if you expressed worry. And I'm not talking about QAnon and MAGA Twitter. I'm talking about Vox and like Huffington Post people. They were saying like, oh, these Silicon Valley guys are just weird, and it's only like like anti-Chinese racism. And so they were more preoccupied about whether we were racist against Chinese people than whether there was a pandemic happening. Right? COVID doesn't care about our categorizations. It doesn't care about our borders. It's just a force of nature. It's like a typhoon, it's like a tornado, it's like an earthquake. We shouldn't be fighting COVID because it's impacting poor people or people of color. We should be fighting COVID because people are dying, period. Right? It doesn't matter, like my opinion is, it doesn't matter what their race or what their class, what country they're in, how old they are. One of the elephants in the room of COVID is it really affects old people in nursing homes. Um, no offense to Americans or Europeans, because there was an article about Belgium. It's kind of shocking to me when I think about it, what we do with old people by packing them into nursing homes and visiting them every now and then. Out of sight, out of mind. The mortality rates in some of these nursing homes in New Jersey or in Europe is terrifying. Like large numbers of people are dying. They're dying miserably. They're dying horribly. This is why some of us were alarmist. And the fact that we're not talking more about this says a lot about us as a society and our values.
Yeah, it seems to me there's been very, very little mourning in
Well,
the
I mean,
US.
they've just pushed it. They've out of sight, out of mind. And one of the complaints that I have about the media is they emphasize like young, attractive. Like I believe that every single young, attractive white woman who has died from COVID has been profiled in the media. Okay, I think that the media wants you to think that it could be anybody, and it could be especially these precious people.
Well, what I find really interesting about that coverage too is the age range that they look at for that, right? So, yes, I mean, certainly the mortality rate is through the roof if you're 80 years old and so on. And in our county, for example, every day when you have new deaths in that age range, they just list the ages and that's it. But what's fascinating to me is that's also the case for the 55-year-olds, the 60-year-olds, the 40-year-olds will get a write up in the paper.
Yes. Yeah.
The 20-something-year-olds certainly will get a write
Yeah.
up.
Yeah.
But even the 55-year-olds get lumped in with that.
Yeah, if you're an old Gen X, you gotta be a young Gen X. Now you just gotta be a millennial. If you're a millennial, you'll get a write up. It's generational discrimination. If you're Generation X, no. If you're Boomer, no. If you're silent, hell no. You know, I mean, the thing with the nursing homes is like I've only read a couple of things because it's like painful to read. It's We have a sociological problem that I knew intellectually in an abstract way, where the way we in quote developed societies treat our old people is that we rationalize them just like we rationalize everything in the economy. And so you take your parent, you put them in a nursing home, and they're taken care of by people who get paid money. What could go wrong? So in normal day to day, that's fine. Even though there are abuses, we all know about it. I'm just saying, like, they will take care of them for money. But now there's a pandemic that they can catch as well from these old people who are miserable, who need extra care and attention. What I read sounds like hell. This is not the way that you would treat your own, because you want these people to treat your parents like they would treat their own parents, but they're never going to. They're not blood. That's not how it is. Okay. It's like we've rationalized it. We don't want to think about it. And so the things that I read in the nursing homes, I'm like, oh, this makes sense in a way, because these are people who are probably being paid minimum wage to take care of old people. And a lot of it's like really uncomfortable. There's some gross things, and now they're like really sick, and they can be contagious to you.
I mean, what's been fascinating to me too is these horrific cases where several bodies are found days after death and they've never been reported and so on aren't just happening in nursing homes in New Jersey and things, but even places like Spain. In cultures where that's not,
Yeah,
um, yeah,
traditional. Yeah, but it's becoming more traditional everywhere. And like old people, a lot of them they want their freedom. I mean, they want to live alone. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to get them to like give up their house. Like, and I know this personally, from anyway through my extended family, and that can be a problem. So we have freedom, and we have this like great economy that provides services to give us this freedom. But I think the problem is we also see that they're the flip side of freedom, where when push comes to shove, when nature, red in tooth and claw, comes at us, all of a sudden you understand why people live in these extended family units where people can distribute labor and things like that, where it's not just about the money, but it's about just a community, and it's about helping your relative, helping your friend, these sorts of things. I feel like we've lost a lot of that. Not everybody, Not every community and not every person, but I know a lot of people who are very alone right now. Quarantine has not been that difficult for me because I'm with my wife and I'm with my kids. Um, I am with my family really as we understand it in the United States, but there are friends that I have who are single, who their lives were socializing with their crew. And so, sometimes like they have to create pods, whatever. I'm just saying those people are undergoing or underwent something very different in quarantine than I did. And that's because of the way we live and arrange our society, where people can live alone and have all their conveniences and not be bugged by their parents or roommates or their siblings and all these other things. But the flip side of that is when the water recedes, just you. That's it. So like I don't know. I honestly don't know what to say because I didn't think we were this society. I didn't think Europe was that society. Like read the article in the New York Times about Belgium. Uh, the government was quite clearly giving the go ahead, not explicitly, but through some channels for emergency paramedics not to pick up COVID positive people that were dying in nursing homes in Belgium for a while because they wanted to keep the hospitals free for people that were more valuable actuarially. They were making the calculation. And so I think that it's been a good opportunity in some ways for genetic science, as you know. Some companies have gotten on board with COVID testing and sequencing and doing all sorts of things. And there's been some good research that's come out of it. But it's been a horrible indictment about the sociology and political science of this country. Not the science. The science has been okay. I think the science has done what it can do. And the primary problem is we had a state capacity issue where I think, Grant, I think most people, quote, in the know, were starting to get seriously terrified by the middle of February. And then when Iran hit around February 20th, I remember screaming at what Donald Trump was doing, going to India right now, when he needed to just like start like really turning the ship around February 20th. As it is, it was closer to March 15th. Those 3 weeks were when New York became what it became. That's when New York was seeded. I think we could have dodged New York. I think we could have dodged that horrible thing that happened in New York, New Jersey, and to some extent Connecticut if Trump had started on February 20th. I think if he had started on February 1st, I think honestly, where our society is, I think the resistance would have said he was being insane. They would have eventually come around, but I think for a long time he would have been attacked because he shut down the economy and did this and that. And it's only some like dumb Silicon Valley bros and paranoid people and a couple of epidemiologists. So I think that would be too early. Ideally, he would have started that early, but it wouldn't be feasible. But I think by February 14th, I think enough people were that he could have done something, and he didn't. But you know what? Cuomo didn't do anything either, did he? De Blasio didn't either. So it's not just a Republican. This is not a left-right thing. Actually, there's a lot of blood on a lot of people's hands in our society, in our elites. And I don't think that they will be held accountable. They weren't held accountable in 2008 when the financial crisis happened, when a lot of people made a lot of money and the government as a whole bailed out the system. You know, um,
Well, and people are upset. And honestly, it seems like a lot of the anger is directed at the measures as opposed to people mourning the deaths of the virus, or people being upset with the incompetence with which it's often been handled.
Yeah, I mean, so I think part of the issue is there's been weird enforcement and weird fixations, and some of it's ideological. So like Florida people on beaches, bad. Black Lives Matter protesters, good. That was pretty obvious. Also, remember that the Ozarks, the party in the Ozarks, that was the first big thing that the media, and it's obviously like okay, let's just like come out and say it, like rednecks in the Ozarks, these are bad people. They're doing something bad. Well, it turned out there wasn't that much transmission at all, from what I know, because it was outside. If it's outside, it's probably not that bad. BLM is probably not those protests probably not that bad. But so the outside stuff not bad, inside stuff bad, right? So when I hear Biden saying we should have masks outside, I'm like, mandatory masks outside is probably overkill. I mean, you don't want to do so much that people don't believe you. I think that there is a problem with some credibility there. that people need to be more measured. They also need to talk about the fact that we're working with the best science we have, and that might change, and we apologize if we lead you wrong, because they did, they have, and we will. There needs to be more humility, less screaming. Um, Also, some people are just using it to kind of be self-righteous prigs, you know. That's not getting us anywhere. Like, you need to persuade people with the facts, and also like show empathy. Like, you're trying to persuade someone not because you want to be right, but because you want them to live. It's like sometimes I hear some people like listen, like talking, or I see things written, and I feel like you're kind of just showing off about how you're right and they're wrong, instead of actually writing in a way that indicates to me that you actually care that these people survive. And some of the stuff that I've heard people just in my social circle or in the media say about, like, people dying in red states, they're almost like happy that these people are being insane. And I'm like, a lot of them are socioeconomically the same type of people that are, like, the Latino field workers in Riverside. I mean, they're working agriculture, they're in rural areas, and I don't really. This seems really inappropriate to me. Like, you're missing the forest from the trees, and what's important. We have a pandemic in this country. It's about people dying, and it's not about who's dying. And on the other side, like, I have heard things about, like, when it was happening in New York and New Jersey, where people were just like, well, it's a blue state problem. And the fact that we are hearing things like this, that people even say this out loud, shows you the problem we're in this country. Like, if you're saying it's a blue state problem, it's a red state problem, what Obama would have said in 2004 is, there is no red America or blue America, but I guess that's very 2004. Like, it's done. That's over. I don't know. I'm being very pessimistic here, but um, I don't see like a unifying vision right now. I don't see a society that can stitch itself back together. COVID-19, like, sometimes these sorts of external shocks can bring people together. And I feel people were brought together for like kind of like a month or two, and then it just all kind of unwound in May. And a lot of it was just like economic pressure, which a lot of people have been under. And that's difficult. I mean, there's just like a lot of difficult conversations that I feel like people are not having compassionately, and I think that's been the ultimate problem. When people are acting out in a crazy way, sometimes there's a reason, you know. And I have friends who are academics, and I'm like, you have like a 10-year job at an R1 university, like your salary is going to keep getting paid indefinitely. I mean, yeah, the university could lay you off, but that's very unlikely with the type of job you have. Okay. And you can do social distancing, you can stay inside. Um, there's a lot of people who are living paycheck to paycheck. They're not in that situation, and this is why they're not being as rational as you. Not just because they're stupider. I mean, they're probably not as intelligent, whatever. But really, like, they have no options. They're desperate. There's that survey that showed that like 30% of young adults have thought about suicide in the last 6 months, and it's obviously an increase. I think some of it is like hysteria and scaremongering, because young adults are not at risk of dying of COVID. But some of it is also like, okay, like, they don't have a job. Where are they going to get a job? What is the future of this country? It's there's a lot of hopelessness. And instead of us stepping up, our elites stepping up to COVID-19, we've kind of fallen down on the job. That's how I'm feeling right now at the end of the summer of 2020. Like, maybe something will change and turn around, and I'll be smiling and I'll be happy. But I stopped, Grant, we've talked about this. I stopped paying close attention to COVID in June, just because it didn't seem like we had what it took to really attack it. And so I'm just like, I will continue doing my quarantine as best as I can, and that's it. I'm not gonna, like, there's only so many people I can talk to, only so many people I can convince. Like, we did convince our family and friends that we could to go into quarantine early. That took a lot of work in March. That's done. And as far as like the rest of society, I don't want, like, I'm not one of those people that's like, oh, you don't wear a mask, you should die. Okay. I want to convince people that aren't doing it why they should. Okay. And I'm also not, I mean, but I'm also going to express my alarm. I mean, I have friends who are just like, you shouldn't be alarmed. Like, this isn't that bad. And, it's just like, when I read about the way people die, it's bad. The only hope, the positive spin I will put on it, I just actually had another podcast today that I recorded with someone about COVID. And I say, like, I do think the herd immunity is probably a little lower than 50% for various reasons. So it will end even if we don't get a vaccine, and we'll pick up the pieces and figure out like what this means for us, because I think after it ends, I feel like people can take a breath and kind of take stock, and I don't know if they're going to be happy with what they conclude about our society. I don't think that we've fully like processed it, because it's not over. We're still in it, like we're still like waking up every day, um, checking the news, checking in our family and our friends, and more and more of my friends have gotten COVID-19. I mean, not that many, but some of them have tested positive and they had the symptoms, and so it's going through my network right now, but uh I don't know. Just kind of on a pause right now, and I feel like our society is on a pause, but COVID-19 is not on a pause. It looks like it's slowly winding through, and we might be incompetent enough that herd immunity is what protects us. So on that down note, that's my COVID talk. I don't know. I shouldn't laugh. Like,
Yeah,
I mean, it's just like, what do I do? This is like a nervous laugh.
yeah. If I were forced to prognosticate about it,
Dark times, man.
I think there's a good chance we're going to hit some kind of a, I don't know about a real herd immunity, but at least an effective herd immunity, transient herd immunity under conditions of social distancing before we get to a vaccine.
Well, so I
Um,
don't know. I think this will change. I think coronavirus will change some things. I don't know if I'm ever going to shake hands again. I'm just,
mm.
it was always one of those things where I kind of did it because of social pressure. I just didn't really want to touch someone's hand. I don't know where they are, what they've been doing, and also like in business, when you shake someone's hand, I'm always thinking like, okay, like how many hands has this person shook today? I'm not just shaking your hand, dude. I mean, like, I'm Gen X. Like I went through like the HIV training, and that took, okay. Like I extrapolated, so I'm not gonna shake hands. There was some stuff out today about how teens are not having sex and not like interested in it. I think this is gonna affect a lot of people with personal contact until we have a vaccine. But even after a vaccine, like this is the first big infectious disease that we've had that has hit our public consciousness this way and had this impact since the 1918 flu. I know the 1957 flu was as bad as this in terms of mortality, but our culture was not impacted in the same way. We
No
have
one talked about it. It's very strange
There are some newspaper reports
contrast.
about it. People died, but the economy did not get hit that badly. This
Well, I mean, it didn't imprint on people's consciousness, right? Like,
Yeah,
sure, it was in the papers, and people working in hospitals obviously noticed, and
yeah.
some people knew some folks who died and so on, but it it wasn't it wasn't really remarkable at the time.
Yeah, the world is different. And like our economy, like, the downswing was as big as the Great Depression in some ways. I mean, it's obviously structurally different, but I mean, okay, like this was worse than 2008. It was worse than anything since World War II. Like Great Leap Forward was really bad. There's bad things that happened after World War II locally, but this is, I think, the biggest global event since World War II. So how can it not affect us psychologically? How can it not change us in terms of how we see, like when I see movies or TV shows where people are in bars, I get the heebie-jeebies, you know? Like I think that'll eventually fade, but it's going to take a long time. And I think there's going to be a lot of people on the margin who are already germophobic who are just going to say, "You know what? I lived through 2020. I don't want to take the risk. I don't want to take the risk. I will drink at home." Or like if you're going to invite me to drink, like got to be a patio place. I know that like
Well, and the
yeah,
virus, I mean, the virus probably isn't going to disappear, right?
it could be
We
endemic.
may get control of it,
Yeah,
but it'll still probably crop up here and there.
it'll be endemic. Yeah, so that's what we're talking about. I mean, that's what we're seeing in places like New Zealand that controlled it. Like it just creeps back in. So until it evolves and gets us virulent, which it might not, um, I think it's going to be here to stay. Now that does mean work demand for services of biological scientists. So um undertakers did really well during the Black Death, I'm assuming. I mean, there's work for people even in a time of COVID-19. So I in a way I feel like the economic and even the mortality impact is going to be dwarfed by the cultural social impact. So, we have small children, Grant, and they just kind of accept coronavirus. My 3-year-old will yell coronavirus at people if they walk too close to him when he's on the front yard. My 3-year-old's also really morbid. He thinks all old people die of coronavirus. Someone recently died, and that we know, and he's like, did he die of coronavirus? And we're just like, dude, there's other like, he doesn't know any other diseases. Like, all he knows is about coronavirus. People talk about coronavirus, and I don't know how my kids get the news. Like, my son has like kind of brownish skin, and he's scared of the police. Not even joking. He's just telling me he should be scared of the police. So I'm like, don't worry about it. I don't know. It's just like, you don't know how kids find out these sorts of, like, as adults, we're trying to, like, pay the bills and not get sick, and you got these little kids running around, all these little kids, and like, what are they thinking? It's just like really weird for them because I have a sister who has a newborn or infant, and um, we don't know if she's scared of strangers or he's scared of strangers. He's never seen a stranger. Never seen a stranger, right? So I've seen doctors, seen parents, and seen grandparents. That's it. Those are the only people that this 3-month-old child has ever like seen up close, right? So it's I think we need to think of the social impacts is the big thing about COVID-19. Because I think we know what the
Great.
PFR is, 1%, I don't know, something like that.
And actually, so you mentioned one positive thing about the herd immunity threshold possibly being lower than anticipated. I'm not sure, but we'll see. Time will tell. But the CFR, does seem to be going down. So the mortality in hospitals, the unadjusted apparent mortality is down dramatically.
And also the people who are getting it are the less. Unfortunately, the more vulnerable people probably got hit first.
Well, even adjusting for the various risk demographics and so on, mortality in the hospital is still down substantially from the beginning of the pandemic. It looks like it's down about 40%. So treatments from remdesivir and all these things, right? Seem to be making a difference. And maybe people are getting initial viral loads that are a bit lower because they are keeping better distance. They're wearing masks. If you're sitting right next to someone at a bar in New York City before they really realized what was happening, you probably would have gotten a higher initial exposure.
Well, so I think my discussion of COVID-19 has been very pessimistic. I think from the purely biomedical perspective, I'm cautiously optimistic. I do think we're putting a lot of we as in the world is putting a lot of resources into vaccine work, and I know that I understand vaccines are difficult to develop. They're not trivial. They're often not very effective. So I don't want to oversell this, but everyone's focusing on this. I would not be surprised if we have a good vaccine in 2 years, perhaps a year. I've heard that China and Russia is already vaccinating people, in government and their army. So we'll know how those trials work. You know what I'm saying? They can take a few risks that we couldn't in the United States. So I think the treatment's going to get better. So I think the mortality will drop. So from a purely biomedical perspective, we will make it through this, just like we did with the 57 flu or the milder 67 flu or it was 68 flu. So that's doable. I think what COVID-19 though has shown is what is the measure of a society. Unfortunately, if I had to bet, if we had Mitt Romney, I think we would be doing considerably better. Okay, just swapping out another Republican. I think Trump, to be frank, is tactical genius, but he has zero strategic vision, and so he's been going from thing to thing. So yeah, I think that's a problem, but I think we still would have had a problem with compliance, with localities doing their own thing, and so I think that's a little disturbing because this
I
liberal
think there
way
would
of
have been
life.
a lot of impatience.
Yes. And in China, they're not going to have impatience because the government will just put you in prison. You know, um, you know. So there are issues like that. I do think the positive lesson would be like South Korea, which is an okay. I mean, South Korea, they say like, oh, there's been an outbreak, but like if you look at the numbers compared to the United States, even adjusting for population, it's nothing. Like if we had South Korea's problems, we would be so happy. you know? And so they have a test and trace capability in part because of previous scares. So, we are in this biotech space, and I do wonder, just things get more efficient as the demand increases, the prices go down, it gets better and better. Why can't, I mean, we have great information technology. Why can't we have spit kits for everybody in the world? Like literally, like everybody in the world. Yeah, like it will be like an expense that we have to take like every year or so to produce new spit kits and all these things. But it'll prevent what we just have gone through as a world. This like massive loss of GDP, productivity, psychological trauma, frankly. I don't know if I should say the word trauma, but I think a lot of people have been traumatized. There have been suicides in third world countries where people are, I mean, Americans are broke, but we're not broke ever, even when we're broke. There have been suicides in India. People have starved in India. Okay. So the outcomes can be quite deleterious. And so we just invested more in the technology to do what we need to do is test, trace, and contain. That seems to be the magic quote solution if we ever deal with something that's very similar. Whereas like, something like SARS, its R naught was lower, I think. And the issue with SARS is it wasn't as asymptomatic. You got it, you go to the hospital, you didn't spread it to other people. The problem with COVID is it hits this like sweet spot of being like 50% asymptomatic, spreading it. And these are the people that are spreading it all over the place and they don't know. So if you had like good testing, so like there's a local outbreak, just tell everyone to test, like mail everyone a kit, just have it there. Why can't we do it? Like we have all of these like other things. We have like cruise liners, we have this, huge like industries that are just for consumption. Why can't we have this one thing to protect us against this tail risk, which is inevitable? There's going to be another infectious disease outbreak in the next generation or two. So have the facility. Obviously it's going to have to be a different test, but a lot of the other things can be put in place. I mean, look at South Korea. I mean, they didn't have a test for COVID-19. They had to create one, but they had the whole framework set up. And so if we're still going to have a World Health Organization, get it done. I think that's really marching orders.
Are you optimistic the U.S. will do that?
If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. I mean, look,
Great.
I
On
want to
that
be
note,
optimistic, okay?
yeah.
I'm optimistic about being optimistic someday. I don't know.
All right. Good stuff.
All right.
Cool.
So
All
I
right.
think I think we're good. So I guess I would say though is even if I have a lot of pessimism and concern about what's happening in this country, um, I am still excited about the world and excited about science and excited about discoveries. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you so much for joining. It's been a really fun conversation.